Welcome to the King County Police Accountability Town Hall. We would like to start by acknowledging that we are on the unceded traditional land of the Puget Sound Coast Salish people, past and present. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the tribes. This acknowledgement does not take the place of authentic relationships with Indigenous communities, but serves as a first step in honoring the land we are on. Hello, everyone. I'm Shannon Chang, an organizer with ACLU People Power. We are honored to be co-hosting this event tonight with the League of Women Voters, Seattle-King County. Before we jump in, we just wanted to let you all know a little about our organizations. People Power is the grassroots arm of the ACLU. We are volunteer-driven and do not work for or officially represent the ACLU. People Power activists work in and from their local communities to further civil rights and liberties for all. Our local group has been active in advocating for police accountability at the city, county, and state levels since 2017. In addition to raising awareness about the King County Charter amendments you will hear about tonight, we have put together a nonpartisan voter guide for this year's Washington State Legislature candidates using a lens of police reform. We invite you to make use of this resource as you make important decisions on your ballot. We are also always open to volunteers of any skill set and level of involvement. We invite you to join us and find your activism superpower. And now, Heather Kelly from the League.
Thanks, Shannon. So I'm Heather. I'm the second vice president and action co-chair of the League of Women Voters of Seattle-King County. It's kind of a mouthful. Lauren Pixley is our other action advocacy folk type of person and is in the wings tonight helping out with backup, as are the rest of the ACLU People Power folks. So thanks to you all for running things behind the scenes. The League of Women Voters was founded 100 years ago this year by leaders of the women's suffrage movement. We're a nonpartisan activist grassroots organization that believes in the power of women to create a more perfect democracy. Our mission is to defend democracy and empower voters, and it's with those goals in mind that our league has endorsed these 4 measures. So we're really excited to be here tonight to get the word out. So let's talk a little bit about King County. The 2019 census actually estimated our population at over 2.2 million people. So we're a really large county. And we're also geographically large. But back to population, about 2/3 of us live in Seattle or its suburbs. And so the first charter amendment that we'll be discussing tonight relating to inquests, it's just important to note that that will apply to all police departments within King County and corrections as well. Charter amendments 4, 5, and 6 apply to the sheriff's office. So 3/4 of the population in our county lives in areas that have their own police departments that their mayors and city councils have oversight over. But King County Sheriff's Office actually directly polices unincorporated King County and a number of partner cities who pay the sheriff to police them. They have contracts with the sheriff's office for those services and a few agencies as well. In total, the people who are directly policed by the sheriff's office amount to only 25% of the people in King County. So you'll hear tonight how our speakers are working to make sure that those folks most impacted by the sheriff's office are heard in the reforms that are taking place. So what is the King County Charter anyway? It's actually the foundation for county government, and it serves kind of the same basic role as the US Constitution does for the federal government. It provides the basic long-term structure for King County government and institutionalizes core values of checks and balances, accountability, and merit. It also seeks to promote an effective and efficient and responsive government. So it kind of sets out the ground rules and values, and it also calls for a citizen commission to be assembled once every 10 years to review the charter and recommend proposed amendments to the county council, which then decides whether to place them before the voters on the general election ballot, which is what happened here. The commission that worked on these amendments was convened, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, speakers, when it's your turn, but I believe it was convened in 2018 and was comprised of 23 commissioners, partially appointed by the county executive and partially appointed by the county council. And the commissioners were chosen to represent a diversity of life experiences and views and political preferences. So there was an effort made to really make it a representative body. And they held town halls in the community as well to gather public input on the issues that they were considering. So why are we here just talking about a few of the charter amendments, 1, 4, 5, and 6? Well, because they all relate to public safety. And so it was natural to kind of group them together since they kind of interrelate and certainly both all touch upon the same issues of racial and social justice in one manner or another. So it's about creating fairness within that system. Charter Amendment 1 briefly relates to inquests, as I mentioned. Charter Amendment 4 relates to the subpoena authority of one of the main law enforcement oversight bodies in our county, the Office of Law Enforcement Oversight, OLEO. Charter Amendment 5 would make the King County Sheriff an appointed position rather than elected. And Charter Amendment 6 would redefine the structure and duties of the Department of Public Safety. So before we get started with our speakers, if you have questions, please drop them in the Q&A box. For those of you who are watching on YouTube, you can plug them into the comments. We'll be gathering them as we go, and then we'll be asking them all together at the end. So as they occur to you, just pipe up. And now I'd like to introduce our panelists. So Sonia Joseph is our first panelist. She was born in Pakistan, the eldest of 4. She has her AAS in computer science and BAS in application development, but she spent most of her career as a massage therapist. Ms. Joseph is the mother of 2 biological sons and 2 stepsons. Her life took a tragic turn in June of 2017 when her eldest son, Giovanni Joseph McDade, was killed by Kent police. After that experience, which included going through the inquest process, Ms. Joseph became an activist for social justice. She now works on behalf of communities impacted by police violence and is currently advocating for police reform at the state level with the Washington Coalition for Police Accountability. Family remains Sonia's #1 priority. Rod Dembowski is on the King County Council representing District 1. He's served on the council since 2013. He was born and raised in King County and attended UW Law School and then was hired by Foster Pepper, where he focused on real estate, land use, and other business matters. He later worked as a policy analyst at the King County Executive's Office and now sits on the council's Law and Justice Committee and is the vice chair of the Budget Committee. Gurmai Zahalai represents District 2. He graduated from Stanford University and the University of Pennsylvania Law School. He grew up in South Seattle, the son of Ethiopian refugees, and lived in public housing supported by a single mother. These experiences shaped his perspective that public policy could design despair, but also hope. And he took that insight to Washington, D.C. as an intern for the Obama administration. After graduating from law school and working at a law firm, he left to co-found Rising Leaders, a nonprofit offering leadership skills to underserved middle schoolers. And he was elected to the council in January of this year and now chairs the Law and Justice Committee. And finally, Councilwoman Jeannie Cole-Wells represents District 4. She holds a PhD in Sociology of Education and an MA in Sociology from UCLA. And she's also a Fannie Mae Foundation Fellow at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. Prior to serving on the council, she served in the Washington State Senate and the House of Representatives. And she spent the early part of her career in teaching and developing expertise in Title IX, civil rights, women in politics, public policy, and human trafficking, to name a few topics. Councilwoman Cole Wells took office on January 1st of 2016 and was reelected last year. She chairs the council's budget committee and sits on the law and justice committee. And before we get into the amendments, since this is the sort of common denominator of the evening, is this idea of public safety and what it means and what we want it to mean. So I'm just gonna quickly go around and kind of just ask you your opinion. And Rod, if we could start with you, that would be great.
Okay, I'm sorry, you want my opinion on what?
On public safety and what's your vision of public safety for King County?
Well, thank you very much, Heather, and to the League and to the ACLU People Powers Movement for putting this together and for supporting these 4 amendments. Your leadership and interest in making King County a more just and fair place to live is actually really admirable, and I'm kind of moved by it, to be honest with you. And I think if Councilmember Cole Wells won't, she might, maybe I'll steal her thunder. I want to recognize that you're all women leading to this panel, and it has been my privilege to get to work alongside you in the last few weeks. And I don't think that that's coincidental. So my view of public safety is one that, I mean, that's a big picture question, but I think what we need to do is have a system where everybody feels safe. And I mean, everybody. And I have to say, I think someone who looks like me, presents like me, has had the luxury of feeling safe because the system treats me better. It just does. And I spent a fair bit of time this summer immersed in much of the movement that we've seen with people rising up, this great, I call it a great awakening in America, that says not everybody has had the benefits that I have had from our system because of what I look like and how I present. And that's not right. That doesn't sit well with me. And I think America showed this year, it doesn't sit well with the majority of Americans. And people want to see a system that treats our neighbors and treats everybody in our community from a public safety perspective fairly and equitably and with dignity. And we have a system rooted in history, like all of our systems, and rooted in a system that has many racist elements, right? Structurally built in. And that system then manifests adverse treatment and disparate treatment, this is my perspective, to folks in the community who don't look like me too often, right? You have a higher chance of getting killed if you're a person of color interacting with the police. You have a higher chance of interacting with the police if you're a person of color, period, right? And so I think it's incumbent upon anybody in our role, and mine in this role, to listen carefully and thoughtfully and try and set aside my own built-in prejudices, which I think we all have, and bring forward change that is reflective of trying to get to that fairer, more just system. And I think that's what these charter amendments are about in part. Nothing, no one thing or even no set of things will deliver us a perfect system. We are always trying to pursue a more equal society, right? A more perfect union, in the words of some of our nation's founding document. It's a continual process. But we have this opportunity at the ballot box here in November to make some concrete change, to bring the voices that have been lifted up this summer from the streets into concrete action that will tear down barriers and allow us to continue the work to get to that more just society. So I've spent a fair bit of time listening, trying to set aside preconceived notions, trying to then take up the torch and advance it in partnership with community. Don't always get it right. But that's what tonight is about. We're going to do, I think, a little educating, but also continue to listen and dialogue and see if we can't continue to make King County, which is named after, of course, Martin Luther King, a better place, a place where that arc that he talked about, maybe though long, does bend toward justice. So thank you for the opportunity to join you tonight, and I look forward to it.
Thank you, Councilmember Dombowski. Sorry, I was asking you to put something so challenging into kind of a soundbite, but
Oh, sorry, that was a long
no,
soundbite.
you're rising to the occasion. It's impossible to do. And so I'm going to ask the same question now to Councilmember Zahale. Can you give us kind of like your big picture overview of what you would wish public safety to look like in King County?
Thank you, Heather, and thank you to everybody who organized this event. I very much agree with what Councilmember Dombowski mentioned. It's really about making everyone feel safe. I remember first talking about our desire to respond to all the movements happening around the country and wanting to change fundamentally what policing looks like in King County. And some of our opponents were saying, why do you want to change things? When we see the police, we love it. We feel safe. We flag them down and ask them to come and help us. And I said, exactly. We don't want to have a system where some people feel safe when they see our current system and others don't feel safe, and the data backs that up, that they aren't actually safer. So what we're trying to do is create a system where everybody feels safer, just like Raj said. And for many, that means creating a system of policing that looks less like one that deploys armed police officers to respond to every single challenge that we see in our region, to one that looks more like a diverse toolkit of public health and community-based responses. When you pick up the phone and call 911 and you want to report something that's concerning to you, aren't you more afraid that you might be causing more harm than good if, say, somebody is having a mental health crisis and you sending somebody with a gun, is that going to actually make them safer or not? We had Marcus Green, who writes for the South Seattle Emerald and the Seattle Times, recently write an article where he talked about having a mental health crisis himself in downtown Seattle, and his mother was with him. And because he's Black and had a mental health issue in that moment and mental health emergency, his mom was more afraid to call the police than to continue enduring what her son was going through in that moment. So instead of calling somebody who could help, they actually just called an Uber and took a risk of, further going down the road of this mental health crisis until they could get back home or to a hospital on their own. We should not have a system where people have to make that very difficult choice. We should have a system where if you call 911 and there's a mental health crisis, you can have this menu of options. You can have mental health crisis officers coming to respond to a mental health crisis. You can have rapid response social workers coming out to respond to people who are in need, people who are unhoused and need to be connected to resources. We should be able to call trusted mentors and violence interrupters for our youth when they're getting in trouble, rather than continuing to send them through the school to prison pipeline. This is what the future of public safety looks like, and that's what's on the ballot this November.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I love that idea of a menu of options. I think that's just so important. Councilmember Cole Wells, I'm going to move on to you. Can you kind of give us kind of your sort of overview or description of an ideal scenario for public safety here?
Well, I kind of hate to go after these two who went before me, because I would have said much of the same thing. How about this? If we had true, real public safety, we would have no need for an Office of Law Enforcement Oversight. We may not have any need for this type of forum either. I mean, that's what it could look like. I've been around for a long time, and I've seen the cycles come and go. And I have a sociological background, so I try to look at this from a macro level as well as a micro level. But when we have true, real, substantive changes, it usually comes about, they usually come about because of a recognition, and this is traditionally speaking, a recognition that by the dominant group, whatever it is, that they're being affected. Now that seems like kind of a weird thing to say, but we can look back historically child abuse. Until child abuse was recognized as happening to the dominant group in society, nothing was really done about it, or domestic violence. Well, the same is true for racial violence, unjustness, discrimination, just across the board. And we are at a pivotal point now where I believe we could go in a new direction. And the council many of us on the council are working hard to actualize that in the budget, the 2-year budget that we're working on. And fortunately, we've had County Executive Dal Constantine transmit to us a very powerful budget in terms of making strides. But discrimination at a macro level is real, and discrimination at a more covert level, symbolic level, is still with us. I want to see us eventually reach the situation where we have absolutely fair access to justice. And if we have that, and we do not continue with disparities, disproportionalities, then we are more likely to have a safe society. So kind of short, but that's my thinking.
Oh, thank you for that. I think we've been hearing so much about budget justice and participatory budgeting, and it's really kind of running in the background all the time, because it's what powers the real public, the public safety component of our county. So thank you. Ms. Joseph, I'm gonna hand it over to you. Tell us from a citizen's perspective what you would want public safety to look like.
Well, it's hard to go after all of these folks who said some great, wonderful things. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak today. My big vision for public safety would be a reduction in police violence and the incarceration rate. As being a woman of color, the statistics and the data shows that people of color are at a high rate for incarceration across the states. And also having obtainable housing for the homeless, and having mental health teams available in conjunction with 911. Because when people don't have their basic needs, a stable home, mental health help, they're not safe, and it's not safe for community. I know this discussion is about public safety, but we really have to address the issue of systematic and oppressive structures that keep people down and discouraged. And having these basic needs met is a start, really, so that people and communities have self-worth and a meaningful existence. Creating measures and structures in systems that are fair and accessible to all people, that'll go a long way to building and honoring the sanctity of life and creating justice for all.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think it's so true. We're used to thinking of public safety as a way of responding to something after the fact. So thinking about it more holistically in terms of preventing incidents from occurring in the first place, I think is so critical. So I want to dive into the amendments now, and just to keep things simple, we're just going to go through them in numerical order. For those of you lucky enough to have your ballots, well, that'll be top to bottom. And one of the things we're going to be coming back to tonight is the question of who these measures impact directly. And that's really where I'd like to start with Charter Amendment 1. Ms. Joseph, since you have firsthand experience of what it's like to go through the inquest process, I'm wondering if you can share about that experience, how it felt to be in court and what kinds of challenges you faced.
Well, I'm here today to share my story, and just bear with me. So my son, Giovanni Joseph McDade, was murdered on June 24th in the city of Kent by Officer Matthew Roush and Officer William Davis with the use of deadly lethal force. The devastation that my family and I felt is just indescribable. I had no idea how the process, the loss, and no guidance on the steps towards accountability and justice. I joined Not This Time for support and guidance during this heartache of trying to fight for justice. The process of bearing my child, looking for an attorney, put a financial strain on me and most families in this type of situation. It costs anywhere from 10 to 20 grand to bury someone, and another 20 to 30 grand to hire an attorney. Most families don't have 40 grand at their disposal, and meanwhile, the officers get a team of attorneys funded by the unions and taxpayers. I quickly began to realize just how unfair this process was. I was reached by prosecutors regarding my son's inquest one day before the first arraignment. I requested that she ask the judge for an extension because I hadn't hired an attorney yet and I needed time to prepare. She called me the next day after court and stated that the judge denied my request and the inquest date was set to proceed in 7 weeks, December 11th, 2017. Only given 7-week notification of my son's inquest was absurd. I reached out to Not This Time regarding the situation with help to search for an attorney, for funding and support dealing with this bias process. Week 3, preparing for pre-hearing. Not This Time, Andre Taylor and Dove Taylor, Ima Joseph, and myself attended. I requested for an extension to have time to get funds and hire an attorney. The judge denied my request, but stated that if I hired an attorney within 1 week, that she would grant me an extension. At that time, Andre Taylor from Not This Time told Judge Mahoney that his organization would fund the attorney, and within 72 hours, we hired 2 attorneys, Pat Bozeman and LaWanda Anderson. Pat Bozeman went to file for the extension and requested for the discovery into the murder of my son and was denied the request. Judge Mahoney stated that she changed her mind, that it was unfair for the other parties involved to be inconvenienced and to have to reschedule the inquest date. My attorneys had no choice but to withdraw because of lack of time to prepare and because of denial of the discovery, and I was left without counsel. I was livid at the injustices that I was experiencing. It seemed unbelievable. My son's death was considered an inconvenience to the officers and their state-paid attorneys. Those were unfair practices I experienced. And even though I got counsel, I was still denied my rights for justice. December 11th, the day of the inquest, I was denied to speak to the judge to ask her a question. At that point, I refused to take a seat and be part of this inquest process that was organized by the same people that failed my son. by a process that was biased and railroaded me through the whole process. I was angry, and I wasn't going to allow this to happen to me and any other family. And I boycotted my son's inquest in the whole inquest process. It was painful to have to grieve, bury your child, pay for everything, have your loved one degraded, criminalized, dehumanized, and then villainized by the false narratives. Having to fight for justice while being disrespected and dehumanized by the justice system was disheartening. And they continued the inquest process without me. There was no real independent investigation into my son's death. There is no accountability. As an impacted family, we want accountability and we want justice served. We want a fair process that views the death as homicides and criminal in nature. We want transparency so that the public and families have a clear view of what the proceedings are. We want families to be treated with respect and dignity. And the deceased person to be treated like a victim of murder. The county inquest process was one-sided and unfair. And I demanded change. And with that milestone, not this time, the Lyles family, the Lee family pushed for reform into the inquest process. This also led to not this time and the PDA office creating the ordinance number 18652. The community calls it Sonia's Law. This ordinance provides families with officers involved shootings to have legal representation in an inquest. The inquest is currently still on hold and are in a lawsuit because of the reform and the pushback from law enforcement. There's a backlog of 34 families in King County waiting for inquests and answers into the murder of their loved ones. My son's case was the last inquest in December 2017 and is also the last inquest without legal representation. Why should you vote for Amendment 1? Because it's a stepping stone towards putting the inquest process in county law and providing a fair process so that families can get answers into the death of their loved ones and be provided with attorneys that have a broad role in advocating for all deaths involving law enforcement agencies, including deaths in custody. I know that this amendment isn't a fix-all for the fallacies in the inquest process, but it's a start. And I think that the councils on here today can work towards reforming the inquest process so that it is fair. I want to share with you that on a state level, I'm working with the coalition that is working towards completely independent investigations so that police do not investigate themselves. Elevating this issue will help remove conflicts of interest and issues with bias. The goals are for a fair process that is credible, transparent, and a path to accountability that no one is above the law. Once this independent entity is engaged, we'll have to reevaluate whether the inquest process has a place and or a value in the steps for justice and accountability. Thank you. Please vote for amendment number 1, Inquests.
Thank you so much for being here tonight and sharing that experience with us, because it really gives rise to the reforms here that we're here to talk about. And I want to turn it over to Councilmember Zahalai, but first let's bring up the slide that has Amendment 1 listed. And do we have the language of the amendment? So what you'll see on your ballot is typed here in the chat box for you. Shall King County Charter Section 895 concerning mandatory inquests be amended to do 2 things. 1, clarify that an inquest is required when a member of law enforcement agency's action, decision, or possible failure to offer appropriate care might have contributed to an individual's death. And 2, to provide an attorney at the county's expense to represent the decedent's family in the inquest proceeding, which is a follow-up on Sonia's law. And Councilmember Zahalai, can you please clarify what has and has not changed since Ms. Joseph went through her experience? Because I know we're sort of in limbo with some of it, and I think it might help the voters to understand the status.
Absolutely. First of all, Sonia, thank you so much for sharing your story and for all the work that you do to make our region better. We appreciate you so much. There's no way that I can make a more compelling case than what Sonia did, but I'll try my best to just explain what the change actually does, as Heather requested. First of all, for those who don't know, an inquest is a fact-finding procedure or an investigation that occurs following a death at the hands of government, whether that's through the police or somebody in our jails. What this amendment would do is 2 things. Number 1, it would expand the scope of what, number 1, it would guarantee an attorney for the victim's family. It would require that King County assign an attorney to represent the victim's family in an inquest proceeding. Like I mentioned before, the inquest is the investigation. And the second thing it would do is expand the scope of what counts for getting an attorney and triggering an inquest process in the first place. Usually it would be an affirmative action by the government, like a police shooting someone. But here, we were also expanding the scope to mean possible failures to act. So if somebody is in a jail cell and needed medical attention and the government failed to act and that person ended up dying, that would also trigger an inquest and the right to an attorney. So those are the 2 things it does: guarantee an attorney, expand the scope of what triggers an inquest, and the right to an attorney.
Thanks so much. And why is it important that that be embedded in a charter amendment?
Absolutely. The charter, you can think of it just like the US Constitution. It's something that is higher level up than our usual ordinances. It's more difficult to change. So it kind of just bakes it in a way that makes it more guaranteed than if it were just through code. Rod and Jeannie, please jump in if I missed something.
All right, I think just for time, we're going to move on to Charter Amendment 4. Thank you both so much for explaining the inquest amendment. So Charter Amendment number 4 relates to OLEO, the Office of Law Enforcement Oversight, their ability to issue subpoenas to gather records. So if we can have Councilmember Cole-Wells walk us through what OLEO is, why this subpoena authority is so important, and the language that you'll see on the ballot is shall section 265 of the King County Charter be amended to authorize the Office of Law Enforcement Oversight to subpoena witnesses, documents, and other evidence related to its investigations and reviews of county law enforcement officers. So, Councilmember Colwell, what does that mean?
Well, it's actually for the short description, it would grant subpoena power to Office of Law Enforcement Oversight, which in doing so would provide clear authority to the office to subpoena witnesses and documents from the sheriff's office, and also to ensure that subpoenaed witnesses have the right to be represented by counsel. Now, a little longer explanation involves, first of all, currently what OLEO is about. Its authority is prescribed by ordinance and includes investigation, review, and analysis of the conduct of county law enforcement officers that have been subjects of complaints and the use of force by county law enforcement officers, regardless of whether it has been the subject of a complaint. And it also prescribes authority to review and analyze internal investigations conducted and disciplinary action taken by the Department of Public Safety. So use of force is a big issue, and the main emphasis with OLEO is to monitor and to be able to investigate and protect really the public in terms of oversight of law enforcement. We think of the King County Sheriff's Office. The Seattle Times, in an endorsement of this measure earlier last month, and then of course a few days ago as well, had concluded that OLEO, as we call the Office of Law Enforcement Oversight, has not been able to complete a large percentage of its reviews due to a very significant reason. And that is because the sheriff's office has not provided access to essential documents or to witnesses. In addition, we have the situation where the King County Police Officers Guild, otherwise known as the Guild, has resisted reforms at the bargaining table. And I think a little bit of history is important here, if you don't mind.
Please.
But it was in 2006, so 14 years ago, in September of that year, that the sheriff at that time convened a blue ribbon panel to determine what should be done to have the public be able to have confidence in what law enforcement is doing, and to be able to review any complaints that come in and so forth. So that was passed, and its charge was for OLE, this new civilian oversight panel, to maintain and improve public confidence in the integrity and professionalism of the sheriff's office and its employees. The next month, right after that, the King County Police Officers Guild very promptly filed an unfair labor practice charge, alleging that the terms of this new civilian oversight process were not subject to collective bargaining process that was in existence at that time. And kind of surprisingly, the next month, the county agreed, and the bargaining ordinance with the unfair bargaining, and did not go ahead with implementation of the ordinance that had been approved by the council the month before. And about 5 years went by in which different ordinances were passed approving collective bargaining. But in the immediacy of those, much of what was in the original authority for investigation by OLEO was eliminated. It's kind of a complex, convoluted process. And another 10 years went by where OLEO was very limited in conducting any type of oversight. So its effectiveness was really hampered. So we did hire a director a few years ago, 4 years ago, I believe, and really the office started to function as was determined to be the need. again, the issue of collective bargaining has continued to be front and center. And the Charter Amendment number 4 is very important, I believe. And as recommended by is recommended to bring the charter in alignment with the OLEO's Enabling Commission. This was what the commission, the Charter Review Commission, came up with. Unfortunately, we've still had the situation where the collective bargaining has continued to be an issue. But if Charter Amendment number 4 is approved by the voters, it will result in a demonstration of the will of the people that we want to have oversight of this law enforcement office, and that the OLEO should be empowered to gather the information it needs to be effective, and it would provide more fruitful outcomes at the bargaining table. Now, we can't control that, even so, with the bargaining table, but what would be very helpful, that any issues that remain with collective bargaining would go to an arbitrator who would be able to impose contract terms. So in short, by approving this amendment, we really would be able to do a better job in ensuring that our Office of Law Enforcement Oversight is doing what it can do to have law enforcement be responsive to the public need, the public will to have oversight of its operations, and I believe would lead to a much better situation for public safety in our county.
Thank you. Yeah, the history, I think, is really important to contextualize, again, why this is going to a vote. And at the same time, explain why the Charter of Justice is so important. In the interest of time, I'd like to move on now to Charter Amendment 5, which relates to whether the office of the sheriff should be an elected or an appointed position. And I'm proud to say that this was something that the League approved unanimously at the board level. So Councilmember Dembowski, I know you sponsored this this measure. Can you please speak to the need for this reform?
Sure. Thank you so much. And this one can be, we described it when we were debating at the council, as maybe a little counterintuitive, because the individual, we all cherish that right to vote and to select our leaders, right? It's something, particularly in Washington State with our populist history, but just as, Americans, those of us that have the franchise and that have fought hard to get it, circling back to the women leaders here, right? Didn't always have it. And oftentimes people of color didn't have it in our history, but it's a real big deal that, and we kind of like to elect our leaders. And we do that now in King County. But I will say, when the charter was first birthed in 1968, before that we were kind of a creature of state law, but in 1968 we had our first charter here approved by the voters, our home rule charter. And that was put together by a group of reformers at the time. And there was a movement, and the League of Women Voters, this is one of your rationales, I believe, for endorsing it, but there was a movement to professionalize government leaders, particularly in the offices that required special expertise, right? And they said, hey, this electing of a sheriff is kind of an anachronistic, system rooted, frankly, in American history, 400 years going back to times when we had enslaved humans. This system was built to enforce those laws and to chase down fleeing and freed enslaved humans. And then after slavery was abolished, to enforce some of the discriminatory laws. Then I talked in my opening remarks about structural racism, and a lot of people may not want to admit it, but the office of sheriff and electing the sheriff is part of a system, in my view, that is rooted in that history. And I think some of the impacts that we see really still come from that. So why should we go, and let me say, and so in 1968, the framers of our charter, they're called freeholders, said, hey, let's appoint the sheriff. Let's have the county executive appoint and the council confirm the best qualified candidate they can get for the job. And that was the case from when the charter became effective in 1969 until 1996 in King County. We had appointed sheriffs. What happened in 1996? In 1996, Gary Locke, who was later our governor and then later became the Secretary of Commerce and ambassador to China, but before all of that, he was the King County executive, what Dow Constantine, the job he has today. And we had a budget crisis then, and he had to cut government costs broadly, and that included reducing some expenditures in the sheriff's office. The council at the time was controlled, it was a 13-member council, by Republicans, interestingly, 7-6, and they didn't like that. And they put a charter amendment on the ballot that said, you know, we want to have an elected independent sheriff who will speak up on budget issues. And also while we're doing it, and Gramai will talk about this next, we don't want you to ever reduce or modify or eliminate the Department of Public Safety. So they put that out there and voters approved it 57% or so. Because we like electing folks. And so from then on, that's the roots of our current system. We've had an elected sheriff. The Charter Review Commission looked at this, studied it for over a year, and they believe we should return to an appointed sheriff for these reasons. And I'll go through them real quickly, and maybe a couple others. But one, to recruit nationwide for the very best candidate. When you run for sheriff, you have to live in the county. And so that limits the pool, naturally. Second, you should be able, they think, to choose the best qualified candidate, even a person who maybe doesn't want to be a politician. I mean, there are a lot of qualified folks who say, hell no, I don't want to be running for office and, you know, all that entails and raising money and everything. That's just not for me. And so it eliminates people right out of the gate. Third, there's a conflict of interest issue inherent in this. And all 5 of our elected sheriffs that we've had since 96 have come from the department. They've been recruited in the department. And many times their campaigns are funded by people in the department, people that have a real interest in choosing the boss, right? And you lose some independence in that, and you lose an outside perspective when an organization selects who it wants to run, and it can have bad consequences. You look up north in Snohomish County, where Ty Trenery fired some deputies for misconduct. They didn't like it. They ran a replacement candidate. And the new sheriff, he won, and he rehired those fired deputies. That's the kind of stuff that we think electing a sheriff can lead to. These are off-year elections, lower turnout, down ballot races. When you think about it, it really is a small turnout of voters that are selecting the sheriff, and it's a sheriff that polices many more folks than that, which raises kind of the next issue. And under our charter language, we would have the involvement from recruitment to appointment to confirmation of a community advisory committee. Electing the sheriff inherently leaves out anyone who can't vote. Think immigrants and refugees. Think folks who may have been involved in the criminal legal system, right? Who've maybe not had their rights restored. Think minors, young people, right? And then not just who can't vote, but who have barriers to voting. Poor folks, traditionally communities of color, folks that are trying to get through life and thinking about who they want in an odd year election to be the sheriff. Frankly, you know, that's not the highest thing on their list. So we would bring forth a stakeholder group of civil rights leaders, communities of color, unincorporated residents in the contract cities, who in your numbers early on were real helpful, are outvoted today, right? Everybody in Seattle votes on the sheriff, but none are really policed by the sheriff. Same Kent, Renton, Kirkland, Bellevue, Auburn, Federal Way. All those residents vote today, but they have their own local police departments, Redmond, etc. So we would lift up voices that are most in a relationship, if you will, with the sheriff, and bring them forward to let them have a bigger say. Then you've got accountability and transparency. When you have a separately elected leader, they have a large say, and this is a big deal for this, about what policies are adopted and implemented in the department. And I really firmly believe that we should have civilian leadership of of people with arms. It's a national principle we have with our military. I think it should apply to law enforcement. Today, we have law enforcement overseeing law enforcement. And when you have an appointed sheriff with council confirmation, you get that civilian leadership that brings a broader set of values to the table. And if they need to make a change, they can. You don't have to wait 4 years for an election, hope that there's a qualified alternative candidate, run a campaign. If someone needs to go, they can go. Finally, maybe not finally, but having the sheriff part of our civilian government like we used to, sitting in the cabinet, will allow us to better bring forth the reforms we want to see in law enforcement with respect to the menu of services I think that Councilmember Zahalai talked about. What is the right response when someone calls 911? I really think that what we're seeing is we need more than the binary response of police or fire, right? The problems that folks are asking 911 to help them resolve are much more complex and broader than those two services. And frankly, a lot of law enforcement officers, they're not really interested, and they would rather not respond to somebody who's homeless in a parking lot and someone calls the police, or having a mental health breakdown, right? They're not trained for that necessarily, and it's not really their focus. We should be able to integrate the public safety department with our other services of the county. When you have an appointed sheriff, you'd be able to do that. So those are kind of some of the reasons. And I will say, when you have somebody working alongside you in the government as an appointed department director, you just get more responsiveness, you get more team playing, and less resistance to the kind of change that the public wants. So those are some of the reasons we're asking folks to give up a little piece of power, and that is that power for direct election, and go with what I would call indirect electoral oversight by electing the county executive and council members who would undertake that role.
Thank you so much. What you said about it being counterintuitive, like I definitely fielded sort of the concerned question, like, you're the League of Women Voters. Why are you advocating for this sort of by proxy method? And equity is really at the heart of it. I mean, and it's about what you said, like, if we're going to create really institutional reform, it's about redistributing power, giving up power where that's needed in order to bring other voices in or amplify them. So it's definitely an area where hopefully others can help with the educating part and get the word out.
And the power we hold in that race, if you stop and think about it, is very diluted as an individual voter. And if you're not one of those people that has that power, you got none under today's system, right? So I really encourage, like, y'all have folks to think about how powerful that vote is in that race, and whether or not our goals as a community could be better achieved with a different model. That's that counterintuitive nature.
Sure. Thank you so much. So Charter Amendment 6 has a lot to it. And I want to make sure we have also time to talk about how 5 and 6 interact. So Charter Amendment 6 is relating to the structure and duties of the Department of Public Safety. And I'm going to turn it over to Councilmember Zahalai to talk about what that means, and also how it came to be on the ballot, because it took a little bit of a different path.
Absolutely. It's really important that both 5 and 6 pass. At the end of the day, as Rod mentioned before, an independently elected sheriff is just that, more independent. We don't need, based on what we've been seeing, based on the police violence we've been seeing nationally and locally, we don't need police departments to be more independent. We need stronger checks and balances. And that's what both 5 and 6 are about. If we don't have 5 and 6 pass, what we're essentially saying is that we trust police departments to police themselves, to create reforms themselves. And we know that doesn't work. We need stronger checks and balances. We need an elected executive, an elected council, community stakeholders to be involved to shape what the duties look like, especially if the community stakeholders look like the most marginalized and most impacted people by police violence. Charter Amendment number 6 would allow the King County Council and the executive to have those checks and balances to bring about the future of public safety. And like I mentioned before, the future of public safety looks like being able to deploy a diverse toolkit of public health and community-based alternatives. I don't need to give the examples again, but mental health crisis officers going out, social workers going out, code enforcement, people who are unarmed going out and responding to things like noise complaints. As a default, we don't need to pick up the phone, call 911, and send out armed police officers to every situation, because that's how you end up with dead Black and brown people. We don't need that. So Charter Amendment number 6 lifts a restriction that is currently on the King County Council. The charter currently says that the King County Council cannot amend or reduce the duties of the sheriff's office. With Charter Amendment number 6, if the public approves it, that restriction would be removed and allow us to do what millions of people nationally and tens of thousands locally, the largest movement in American history, has been asking us to do. And that is to be able to transfer public safety functions away from traditional law enforcement as a default, so that we have these other alternatives, so that we're supporting communities in a more effective way. That's what Charter Amendment number 6 would do. And now to answer the question about where this came from, yes, this was not one of the Charter Review Commission recommendations. All the other ones that you heard today, 6 out of the 7 went through that 12-month Charter Review Commission process, and they were recommended by those individuals and through that process. Charter Amendment number 6 came through the King County Council. We were hearing tens of thousands of people literally coming to our doors, knocking on our doors. People like Sonia, people who've been impacted by police violence, telling us we need to do something differently and the time is right now. It just so happened that we were in the middle of the charter review process. We're already sending 6 amendments to the ballot. Let's add this 7th one that is directly responsive to the people who've been most harmed by our criminal legal systems. Let's put that on the ballot and let the people decide if this is what they want the future of public safety to look like. So it came through council ordinance. We put it on the ballot. As you know, we cannot unilaterally change the charter. So you'll never see a situation where the King County Council is itself scratching out pieces of the of our charter and saying what we want. We can, however, put it on the ballot for you, the people, to decide, and that's exactly what we did.
Got it. So this was the council's response to how things played out this spring and summer in the wake of George Floyd's murder and the uprising that we've seen.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. So we did have a question actually from a couple different sources, and then I'll open it up to some of the questions we've gotten during this town hall. But one of the things I was hoping council members Dembowski and Zahalai, you could discuss is how how 5 and 6 interact. Because I know that there are different potential outcomes. So would 6 still function if 5 didn't pass, and vice versa? Voters have been asking about that.
Rod, do you want to take it?
Unmute yourself.
I think he
there you go.
You go ahead, Gurmai.
So ideal situation is that they both pass. That would enhance and maximize our ability to create some of the changes that we've been asked to do by movements all around the country and locally. If one or the other doesn't pass, they do not depend on one another. So we could have one or the other pass without the other. Would they be less effective without one another? Yes. So let's say that we have an elected sheriff and we can change the duties as a council. That might create some strange dynamics, but it would still work. We could have an appointed sheriff and not be able to change the duties if Charter Amendment 6 passes. That's fine, because we could still work through the executive and the community stakeholder process that appoints the sheriff to implement some of the things that our most harmed groups want to see.
Got it. So 2 checks and balances, always better than 1. But I thank you for walking us through that. I kind of feel like I forced you to walk us through like a spreadsheet.
No, that's
I'm seeing it go in different directions.
Yes, no, no, yes.
it's very observant. We had to work pretty hard to make sure with our lawyers that, and they first thought maybe they couldn't, but to make sure they both could stand independently so voters would have an absolute choice. We felt that they each was important, and we didn't want to sacrifice one for the other. So we wanted folks to be able to choose.
Great. Thank you so much for making a valiant effort to have folks understand that very like nuanced sort of technical aspect of things. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up some of the questions that we've gotten here as we've gone through the amendments. And one of the questions here is so somebody wrote, I was so angered and sad about George Floyd's murder. A friend told me about 8 can't wait, which sounds like a good idea. Would these amendments mean you could get our sheriff to adopt the 8 rules? So I think that might speak to kind of the scope of duties amendment. So would that give you the authority to force additional reforms through, I guess, is the broader question?
Yes, I'll jump in on this and my colleagues can fill it out. But the 8 can't wait are a set of reforms that some departments are doing, and the sheriff's office has made pretty good headway on those. But that's by choice of the sheriff, right? Because she controls the policy manual and those sorts of policy setting documents. And if you had a new sheriff that was elected who disagreed with those, they could be walked back or changed on day one, right? So those are some good starter reforms, but it goes to the issue of the independent nature of that sheriff, and if he or she rejects reforms, that's largely within their bailiwick. Case in point, the Office of Law Enforcement Oversight recommended in an independent report reviewing a couple of incidences, dozens of changes. They came and did a follow-up, and the quote was, they were left to die on the vine. They were left to die on the vine. The sheriff disagreed with some of that, but that's what the independent reviewer said. It was reported in the Times. There was a link in the chat box there. I submit that if the sheriff were working alongside and for the county executive and under the council, reforms would not be dying on the vine. There would be full throttle implementation of making those recommended changes for a better law enforcement department.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I hear you saying is this is like ideally an avenue towards greater collaboration rather than polarization.
Yeah.
So we have another question about how these amendments, and I think this is a reference mostly to 4, 5, and 6, how these amendments at the county level could impact city police policies. And the attendee has pointed out we need the same actions in city policing. Do you see like a bridge towards sort of greater reform at the city level because of this?
Well, I don't want to dominate the conversation, but the cities, all 39 of them in King County, this is a case in point, appoint their police chief. Even the contract cities where King County provides contract, the city managers and the city councils choose their chief. And in doing so, let's take a non-contract city. They are able to set policy directly, and that's what we're trying to do here with the county, is really catch up to the ability that the cities have to make changes without the obstruction that we've got today because of our system. So I think they're ahead of us to some degree.
I'm actually going to ask a slightly different version of the question to Councilmember Cole Wells. You've been in Olympia and you've kind of seen how reforms can trickle up or trickle down. Do you see like a similar bridge up to state legislation and reforms at that level, that the kind that Sonia is talking about working on?
Well, sure. I mean, it can happen either way, of course. And we're defined in many ways by what we can do by the state statutes. So we can't do something in defiance of state statutes, but we can have influence. But also many of the reforms that we would like to have are allowable. But right now, for example, with the subpoena power, our sheriff, and I'm not basing this on our current sheriff. It's been whoever has been sheriff and will continue to be the case unless 5 and 6 are approved by the voters. But we can request something of the sheriff and the sheriff can just refuse to do it. Now, that's not how state statute, I believe, envisions what law enforcement is all about, but that's the reality here. Now, we lobby the state legislature every year for changes that we would like to see because sometimes we need to have that state authority. I think another good example with this is with the Police Officers Guild. Right now, they can pretty much just thumb their noses. And if we don't have the authority in the charter to be able to obtain materials when OLEO is making an investigation and wants to report recommendations, but doesn't have the full complex of what is in the sheriff's office, then we're stymied. So it's something that is a continual dance, I think, around it. Now that, and I want to comment too on the situation with the cities. We know that, I mean, right now, law enforcement officers who are sheriff's deputies in our contract cities don't wear the sheriff's deputy uniforms. They wear the uniforms of their city. Rod, what are some examples in your district?
I have 3 contract
Badgers and
cities.
everything.
Yeah, Shoreline and Kenmore and Woodinville are the 3 contract cities in my jurisdiction.
But they wear uniforms.
Yeah,
that-
Shoreline Police Department, Kenmore Police, Woodinville Police. Mhm.
So I understand that people are concerned. They don't want to give up their right to vote for the sheriff or whatever, but they want oversight. And we're allowed to have that, but we believe we'll have more oversight if it's in the county charter, which again is not just like the federal constitution, but it's like the state constitution. And so that's what we are asking to have done, to be done.
Got it. Thank you so much, both of you. And please, anybody else who wants to jump in before we move on, just give a wave. But we have another question back to OLEO, actually. So if I could stay with you, Councilmember Cole Wells. This person is asking, who's the director of OLEO? What kinds of things have they uncovered? What's the track record there? So a little bit of background on the agency.
Well, first of all, we have a new interim director because our former director who served for the last number of few years has left. And so we just started. What is our new OLEO director's name? Adrienne Watt. So we're working with her. We are embarking on a national search for a new director to be able to have the best person be able to be hired. What was the other part of your question? I'm sorry.
Sure. What's their sort of track record for keeping police accountable, and what agencies do they investigate?
Well, it's mainly the sheriff's office, and this is the real root of the issue here for Charter Amendment number 4 is in Law and Justice Committee that Councilmember Zahalai now chairs. They make reports to us, but they can't get all the information needed when they have an investigation, a report. The sheriff's office does not provide all the information needed, and we cannot mandate that they do. So this is why we want to get, for example, subpoena power for individuals, witnesses, but also for materials that are requested, can't get to them. So the Office of Law Enforcement Oversight has been stymied in many ways. And I don't know, Germay or Rod, you want to add anything to that?
I think you spoke perfectly on the structural limitations
Yeah.
of that office, Jeannie. I want everybody listening to this to really think about what would an office of law enforcement oversight look like if it were going to be truly effective in that position. Think about that. Would they be able to demand documentation so that they can do effective investigations? Yes. Would they be able to hold officers accountable for misconduct and decide on punishment? Yes. Would they be able to work with that office to implement policies that maximize accountability and reduce police violence and restrict use of lethal force? Yes. Right now, they can't really do any of that because, for example, the police officers guild has to be negotiated with if we're going to make any kind of change. Think about any high stakes job in the world. Think about surgeons, for example. Imagine if surgeons were to tell you, hey, the only ways you can hold me accountable are the ways that I agree to. Would you go and do surgery with that surgeon? If you were like, if you mess up, you can only hold me accountable the ways that I agree to. That's the situation we have right now because oversight is subject to collective bargaining. So anytime we're renewing a contract, things like oversight, how we hold people accountable, how we hold people accountable for misconduct, these are things that we have to bargain and negotiate rather than them being truly independent functions. And these are state law barriers that we have that require those processes. If you ask any one of us, Rod or myself or Jeannie, oversight, like the Office of Law Enforcement Oversight, should be a truly independent function with the tools to hold that department accountable. And it's just not right now.
And just one more thing on that. I think it's rather obvious that the Police Officers Guild does not want the changes that are appearing in these 4 amendments. In fact, they put up, I believe, $165,000 recently in their campaign to fight these.
And I just want to add one more thing. I always try to be careful about this police union guild talking point because we're not attacking union rights, right? We're very pro worker, pro union. Like I completely understand why officers want to negotiate things like wages and benefits and working conditions. We all want officers to be safe and to be paid for their work, and they have a right to negotiate like any other worker. But when you're talking about accountability for misconduct, when you're talking about oversight, that should not be subject to bargaining.
So staying, oh yeah, chime in, please.
Just very briefly, I sense we may even have some deputies or officers watching. I have not understood the strong opposition that has come from our law enforcement community to a reasonable oversight structure. I asked them to reflect on the corrosive results of consistent opposition to civilian oversight. What are you worried about that we can't fix? Is it fairness in the process of reviewing a complaint, right? Is it transparency? Is it having, due process? All that can be negotiated. Those are reasonable concerns. But the wholesale, rigid, ongoing rejection of robust oversight when there's a complaint or misconduct does not, over the long term, help you. And it leads to frustration in the community and from their elected leaders like us to say, we're going to have to make more drastic changes. We're going to have to really uproot this system because it's not working for folks. You can go too far in your resistance. And I submit to folks that that's the case here. A decade of resisting oversight and just saying no has got to come to an end. And it's regrettable from my perspective that we didn't have, again, from my perspective, honest, good faith bargaining at the table to stand this up. And I think that's why you see where it calls to say, take it off the table. Take bargaining of oversight absolutely off the table. That's a management right. and it shouldn't be there. I think you're going to see a lot more resistance to approving another contract that doesn't have real robust oversight. And we do have that power at the county, at the county council, to just say, no, we're not going to, no more until we have it. But I would echo Gramai's comments. Almost every professional has an independent overseeing body that can take a look when things don't go right. And it's accountability, but is also improvement in that profession, right? That's a second benefit you get from it, because you learn from those circumstances, you report back, you take those things into account, and then you change and you get better. We should have that here. And I call on law enforcement to partner with us, honestly, and bring forth a system that protects your due process rights. That's reasonable, but also doesn't stymie a reasonable public interest, and that is accountability for when things don't go right. And that happens in every organization, not just law enforcement.
And may I add one thing, Heather?
Please.
I think it's important to note that if these charter amendments were adopted, and I'm talking mainly here about the subpoena power, that would not make us an outlier. Right now, throughout the country, cities of our size, larger cities, smaller cities, have civilian oversight agencies and that have subpoena power. Examples are Washington, D.C., Chicago, Denver, Los Angeles, New York, Rochester, New York, San Francisco, San Diego, Albuquerque, St. Paul, Denver, and so forth. So this is not something that is just come to us out of the blue or to the Charter Review Commission at all. It's reasonable. It's a standard practice. And as I read some of the cities, there's a much lengthier list. So I think it's something we should do.
Thank you so much. And the League, of course, would welcome a chance to facilitate that kind of robust collaboration and discussion in the future. So definitely would, if there are law enforcement folks who are watching and you want to reach out to the League, we'll drop our website in the chat and you can contact us. So somebody has written in, I'm trying to find it. Okay. Here's a question for you, sharing kind of a different perspective. So I live in Sammamish and I'm really worried about crime. What if the cities that use the sheriff don't want the reforms that the council passes? So we have somebody who's concerned about the reforms, who's in one of the areas that's directly policed by the sheriff.
Are they talking about the charter reforms?
I think that's what they're talking about. Yeah.
Well, so that would be the voters passing them, right? So that we've put them out to the voters to decide. The council can't make any changes here, so it would be up for the voters to determine. And I will say, as somebody who represents 3 contract cities, I get favorable feedback on most cases about, and most of the time about the service we provide through our Department of Public Safety. That doesn't mean people don't want to see these kind of reforms with respect to enhanced civilian oversight and taking a look at what the department really needs to do in terms of services. I mean, tens of thousands of people marched in my district, and I represent North King County, including in Shoreline and in Kenmore and in Woodinville, asking for movement on these issues in policing. So I don't believe, as someone who's represented this district now for 7 years and feels I know it pretty well, that these are somehow issues that are totally Seattle-centric or super urban in nature. I believe that we have had a great awakening, and this summer, this year, that has been building for a long time. And now you've seen it come to a majority position. Councilmember Colwell's talking about it from a sociological perspective. People want to see this movement. So to answer the question, I suppose if a city council in any of the contract cities wanted to have a different provider of service or start their own department, they can. That's a power that the cities have. But I believe that we have an ethical obligation as a contract provider to provide services in an ethical way. I'm using the word ethics there, and that are true to our values. I don't believe we are obligated to provide a service to any contracting party that is fundamentally contrary to the values of this community. And if a city wants that, they should shop elsewhere. I'm not interested in providing it.
Do any of the rest of you want to speak to that concern about anybody in one of the directly policed communities in your district who might feel like this isn't for me?
Yeah, so sorry, Jeannie, do you want to?
No, go ahead.
Okay. I was going to say that what gets lost in the public discourse on this topic is that the people who are advocating for change and a better system of public safety are doing so because they want to increase public safety, not because they want to create lawlessness, as some people who are opponents to these changes would argue. Yeah, so we're doing this because we want to make sure crime goes down. We want to make sure crime is handled more effectively and the root causes of crime are addressed. So we're doing this because exactly what your concern, the concern that you're stating, we want to address that. I'll give you one example. One of the problems that we see right now is that police departments get, reliable, consistent funding and a budget that's growing every single year. And then public health and community-based alternatives that are often much more effective at addressing specific things are always connected to these volatile revenue sources. They have to fill out tons of paperwork. They can't really plan year in and year out on what their budget's going to look like. So they're not able to provide the best service that they can. That's a inefficient way of doing things. One clear example for me is our Mental Illness and Drug Dependency Fund, MID. This is the fund that goes and provides resources to really critical things like mental health crisis officers and drug courts and all these things that are public health responses to people undergoing mental health crises. That fund is connected to sales tax. So COVID-19 comes through, ravages our county. People are not going out and spending money anymore. Sales tax plummets, and then MID plummets. And so it's not providing funding to these really critical services. What does that do to crime? It makes crime go up because people who are going through crises are not getting the treatment and the responses that they need. And again, that's because we've connected this really vital resource to a volatile source of funding, unlike what we do to some of our criminal legal systems, which is they get reliable, consistent funding, budgets that are growing and growing and growing every single year. What we're saying is that, let's not keep doing that to the detriment of all these other really important things that we need to fund. And so when people talk about being afraid about crime going up, no, we're allocating resources in a way that will more effectively and more efficiently address crime.
Thank you. And I know we're running really short on time, but Councilmember Cole-Wells, did you want to speak to that as well?
Well, I think an important factor here, and this could be for Charter Amendment 5 as well as 6, and even to some extent number 4, is we are elected by our constituents. Right now, even if our constituents want us to do something differently vis-a-vis with the sheriff's office, with law enforcement, the sheriff is a separately elected official, and we are not able to mandate that things change. But the people do have the power. They can work with their elected officials, their representatives on the council or the city council and a chartered city, or rather a city that contracts with the sheriff's office. We're the representatives, but we can get more done right now under the system that we have. We cannot. And so what we're trying to do here is actually give more voice to the people. And I think the appointment versus elected sheriff and number 6 really will help that out, even though it does seem counterintuitive.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that all of you chimed in there at the end. So let's see. I know we're at 8:30, so I'm just gonna close us out here. I want to thank our panelists so much. I know it's budget season, it's election season, and I hear there are one or two other things going on in the world. So I'm really grateful to have you here. Hopefully this format actually made it easier for folks to come and hear from you, and learn why you are the driving forces behind these amendments and getting them onto the ballot. So thanks so much for being here, Ms. Joseph, to share your lived experience. That's really at the heart of all of this. This event would not be complete without that extra perspective, and we just so appreciate learning from you. So thank you for joining us. The League and ACLU People Power are proud endorsers of these 4 amendments for police accountability in King County, and we urge everyone to vote yes on all 4. The Charter for Justice website is available in chat for you to go visit. And also, we are asking anybody who wants to learn more about the League of Women Voters or ACLU People Power to go ahead and share your contact information in the form that's been provided right now in chat. There's a link where you can give us permission to contact you to follow up with additional resources and ideas for how to pitch in. And there's also more information. We got a couple questions about the coalition that Ms. Joseph is a part of, doing incredible things at the state level. So there's some links there. You can learn more about the Washington Coalition on Police Accountability? I believe that's the name of it. There's a Facebook link and a Twitter link for De-Escalate Washington, where you can learn more about their ongoing work. So thank you so much. We're so grateful to be here, and obviously everybody vote. Get out there. Your ballots were sent out yesterday. So I think we're just gonna sign off, call it a night.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Heather, and everybody.
Yeah.